Hello and welcome back to Psychosocial Wednesdays. This today is the start of another exciting year filled with interesting topics and fantastic guests, and we're really thrilled that you join us tonight. For those tuning in for the first time, let me give you a quick overview. Psychosocial Wednesdays is brought to you by JUNGIANEUM, contemporary initiatives for analytical psychology and neo-Jungian studies. Each episode is recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so you can re-watch or catch up anytime, just in case you have to leave early or miss out on one episode. Our mission, like all JUNGIANEUM projects, is to strengthen society's ability to engage in meaningful conversation. That is something we believe the team of JUNGIANEUM is more important than ever these days. Before we dive in, a heartfelt thank you goes out to the IAAP for endorsing Psychosocial Wednesdays. This year is the sixth season already. I also have some updates and announcements. We have been busy during the last couple of weeks. First, we are excited to share that Verena Cast's The Association Experiment in the Therapeutic Praxis is now available on Amazon. It is part of JUNGIANEUM's Recovered Classics series, and I will post a link for you to this book in a minute into the chat, so you can purchase. And I also have another exciting update. JUNGIANEUM is hosting its first ever conference at the end of the spring or early summer. The dates are May 31st and June 1st, so save these dates. And the title of the conference, I can already tell, is Democracy on the Couch: Who or what is hindering humanity from living peacefully on Earth? So a very intriguing title and for sure an unmissable event. It's online, so the barrier is low. And over the next few weeks and months, we will share more details about the program, about our speakers and guests with you. So through all our channels, Facebook, Instagram, and our mails. But now let's turn to today's program. We are honored to welcome Pia Skogemann from Denmark as our speaker. Hello, Pia. Pia Skogemann is a Jungian analyst with a master's degree in archaeology and comparative religion. Very interesting bio. She co-founded the C.G. Jung Institute in Copenhagen in 1980 and has been a teacher, supervisor, and director of training for over 4 decades there. She also served on the executive committee of the IAAP from 2001 to 2007. And today we will be talking about her groundbreaking book, Waxing Femininity. That's this one. And you will also get a link to this book in a bit. This was originally published in 1984, so that's 40 years old. It was a Danish bestseller and it captivated readers for over these 40 years, and it's now available in English. That's why we meet here today. It was also republished by JUNGIANEUM as part of our Recovered Classics series. In Waxing Femininity, Pia Skogemann reinterprets Jungian concepts like the anima, shadow, and archetypes through a modern feminist lens. The title itself, Waxing Femininity, sounds very evocative, and Pia Skogemann, we can't wait to hear your insights. So without further ado, I would say the floor is yours. Everybody enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is so interesting for me, and it evokes such strange feelings because for you, the audience, it is a new book. For me, it's a 40-year-old book. And it brings me back to my own beginnings, even about 50 years ago when I began analysis myself. So you will hear a couple of my own dreams from back then along this presentation. So then I remember my project with the book in Denmark was originally double, because I wanted to present the development of women, the psychology of women, but I also was trying to make Jung's idea accessible to a general audience in Denmark. Jung was not very well known at the time, so it was written in a way that should be readable for a broader audience also. So it contains 5 chapters, and chapter 1 called The Journey to Crete. It is also containing a short overview of basic Jungian concepts. I will come back to the title in a minute. Chapter 2 is about the man and the woman, the animus, and its theory about it and a lot of things. Chapter 3 is a long dream series about the animus development in the individuation process. And then we have chapter 4, the woman and the female, also theorizing. And chapter 5, the female individuation, that was probably the thing that was really my climax and interest. And that also contains a long dream series. Both chapter 3 and 5 are from the clinic, a lot of dream series to illustrate my points. But I will not go into that. You can read the book to read that. So I will instead read you some overall extracts from the book, so you will get the point, the ideas of the book. I will begin with the very beginning, which is my initial dream from my very first therapy session, and that's why I go 50 years back and not 40. You know, we place, as Jungians, a special meaning to the initial dream, but of course, I did not know anything about that at the time. But my dream was that I won a fortune, and I wanted to go to Crete, and I wanted to invite all kinds of people to go with me on the flight with the fortune I had won. And I had approached the analyst because I was engrossed with the idea of becoming an analyst myself, and I was equally fascinated by the few Jungian books I had read at the time, those who were translated into Danish. Well, since I had no real relationship to Crete, the analyst remarked that then it must be the mythological Crete. And so it was. And my own inner journey there brought me to the theme of this book. That's why I mention it, because the mythological Crete is the island of the great goddess when we go into it. It was there before the Greek patriarchal culture flourished. It was there the Greek god Zeus was born and nourished by bees. It was there that Theseus defeated the monster Minotaurus with the help of the wise Ariadne, but then shamefully abandoned her. She was left on an island where the god Dionysus took her as his bride, and her golden bridal wreath in the mythology can be still seen in the sky as a constellation of stars. But that is almost all we have seen of poor Ariadne since then. The traces of female wisdom combined with Dionysian ecstasy must nowadays be unearthed by the unconscious. It has all rested there throughout patriarchal culture. So, to go closer to female psychology, we could turn the myth upside down in a way. From a female developmental point of view, Theseus is a woman's masculine side, her animus, which she has to get to know anew. We need to look at how the patriarchal animus plays out in the psyche of the woman, and how she can prevent him from leaving her in the arms of a god who will forever stand out as the one she loved, Theseus, she loved in vain, and who ended up becoming her enemy. How can female wisdom return from the celestial regions, or rather for us, the collective unconsciousness, and approach the earthly sphere? So let me jump forward to some extract from the animus chapter. When dealing with the animus problem in women, one must, of course, look at the personal side of the case, at the nature of the relationship with the woman's parents, but at the same time, we are already touching on a collective problem. Fathers and mothers are not unaffected by the currents of the times, nor are they unaffected by the deeper currents of the collective unconscious. Jung said that every new roses carries a germ of the future, that it is a price an individual pays, either for not being adapted to circumstances or for not being adapted to himself or herself. In such an era of great change, many people become now neurotic by not realizing, in a way through no fault of their own, the changes that have already taken place deep down in the psyche. They try to hold on to the traditional way where tradition no longer suffices. This is very much the case with the animus problem of the modern woman. Just a few generations ago, among our grandmothers, my grandmother, women were not at all expected to realize the aspects of themselves that were traditionally considered male. It is true that ideas about women's emancipation and equality were already stirring at the beginning of the 20th century, even before also, but it was small scale, and the post-war period even brought a distinctly reactionary wave. In many cases, it meant that the women who had their children in the 1940s and 50s consciously tried to live up to the very traditional ideals of women as good mothers and housewives, but they neglected to realize themselves as persons. However, I am convinced that the first wave of women's liberation lived on in the unconscious and therefore also strengthened the animus of the mother's generation. Now, when I'm saying the mother's generation, remember to put it back 40 years. Because that was the time I wrote it, via the unconscious. Although it didn't look like it on the surface, in reality, patriarchy was being undermined from within. Fathers were away from home, and in many cases, it was the mother's animus that ruled the home, only with the father as the overriding figure of maybe terror. I don't think it is a coincidence that it was the daughters of this generation who really kick-started the women's movement, rebelling against traditional gender roles and the values of patriarchy itself. Indeed, there has been real changes in society in terms of women's equality with men that our foremothers could only dream of, and that some of them actually dreamt of it. I've heard met some old women who had such dreams, actually. Very interesting. In principle, the modern woman has the opportunity to realize herself in a way that was unthinkable in the past. But there's still a long way to go before women really get to know their inner man, their animus. The woman's traditional way, a natural way of dealing with the animus, is projection, seeing qualities and possibilities in the man that she herself should do something to realize. A projection is by definition unconscious. It really looks to her as if it is the other person who has these qualities. The woman, but with perhaps lesser, but to her important talent for painting, marries a painter and then stops painting herself, but instead supports him in his strivings. Such a projection may well last a lifetime, and both parties could be relatively satisfied. It only becomes problematic when, for one reason or another, it becomes necessary for the woman herself to withdraw this projection. So there are many, and it's not always from the woman. I heard a story about a painter couple in the beginning of last century, and they married. She was a talented painter too, but when they were on their honeymoon, he took her painting things, threw them out of the window, and said there are only room for one painter in this family. It was that time. I don't think that happens anymore. Of course, I myself had an animus problem too when I began therapy. And I'll tell you another dream. I write it also in my book, only a few months into the analysis. The dream is, for Jungians, very, very easy to understand. I have an appointment with my analyst. There are so many people all the time that I cannot get to it. There's one person in the flat in particular who keeps getting in the way, a strange male figure, shapeless, like the cartoon character who appeared in the advertisement for Michelin card tires. Is that still in anybody's memory? It was it was supposed to advertise for speed and energy and, in cars. The wheels. Well, but here he's just a flat cartoon figure. He wants to sleep with me, and I push him away in disgust. Eventually, I get to the analyst's house, but he has now been replaced with his wife, which was unknown to me in real life. I tell her about the strange man out there. She explains to me that it has something to do with the method they have on their side. You sort of unravel people, she says, or rewind them, and then you build them up again. She shows me a picture, which is a kind of symbol of how far you can go with that method. As soon as she shows me the picture, it becomes alive, like a film. It shows the young Churchill on horseback, surrounded by riders. He raises his sabre and throws it into the air as if in triumph, and is followed by the other people. Then I leave the consultation room, and in the flat I meet the strange man again. But this time I'm moved by compassion and embrace him. Then a very strange thing happened. He transforms and becomes a real human being. Eventually, he becomes my brother, and we sit down side by side on a couch and read a book together. That's the end of the dream. So it was a very strange, undifferentiated animus, this Michelin man, who also stood in the way of a deeper contact with the analyst. He represents the animus in a raw, unformed force, first stage of animus development. I was at that time completely intellectually undisciplined. I was quite young too. I was 23, 24 years old. And the energy he represents was not at all available to my consciousness. This is also shown in the fact maybe that I want nothing to do with him. When I finally reach the analyst, he has become a woman. And I think it represents a deeper level of emotional contact. On the one hand, the anima of the analyst. On the other hand, a piece of unconscious femininity in myself. But she explains to me about the man in words that are clearly an image of the analytical process in itself. If I didn't know about it, which I really didn't at the time, the unraveling and the subsequent construction. So Churchill was the image of what you can achieve in the future. Strangely enough, I had no conscious experience of Churchill, as something special. In my mind, he was just a very old man with a perpetual cigar in his mouth. But then of course, afterwards, I read his biography and gave me somewhat different view of the range of his personality, for better or worse. He could said to be representing the third, what we usually call the third animus phase, the word and the master of words. I think he was really known to that. You still often see quotes from Churchill, which are famous. And he was an excellent organizer. So the dream actually suggested that there was an animus possibility, which, if integrated, could release some such qualities in myself. But it had to start with the Michelin man and his unformed energy. So it is interesting that it is my or any woman's attitude towards this negative animus that has to be changed in the first place. It has to be approach a form of devotion. No, without that, no transformation will take place. And it is not a sexual thing here. Actually, it's on the contrary, because the Michelin man becomes the brother. So it's quite asexual, and we sit reading a book, utterly chaste. The result for me, actually, shortly after, was that I resumed my interrupted university education and began studying the comparative religion. And like a miracle, I realized that I have now acquired a capacity for self-disciplined study that I simply never had before. The unconscious had it. So, and now at 40 years distance, I can say more about the image of Churchill, because it was not only that I managed to have my university degree, but more important, for my whole life, I have been kind of organizing and building the Jung Institute in Denmark, and have been involved with that for years and years. But at that time, I had no idea that that was in the future for me. But that was the organizing quality of the figure. In many other cases, however, you will find that the negative animus has not exactly affected the capacity for self-discipline. There are women who have already completed their education and are perhaps well into some kind of career, but are stuck in it. Such a woman can be severely plagued by perfectionist demands from within, if the negative animus ever whispering is not good enough, only perfect is good enough, and so on. That inner criticism is often coming from such a male figure. Yeah, so the woman has to, that's more clinical. The woman has to manage to establish an emotionally orientated attitude towards its animus. And there must be a realization of what it stands for. It's a question of finding out where in her life the woman has the possibility to make an intellectual or creative contribution. Could be, for instance, that the woman has been propelled into a profession by an ambitious animus, but has neglected some minor artistic talent because it was not great enough. But indulging in such a practice anyway can provide an outlet for a pent-up and therefore negative animus energy. Generally, however, the problem is that the animus may cause the woman to aim too unrealistic high. She may have a head full of fantasies about creating a marvelous new philosophy, writing the book of all time, taking a new degree or whatever. A symptom is simply that she can never get comfortable taking the first modest steps. The animus fantasy is too big, so it is too difficult to realize how far there is to go. But if she does, and if she works on it, then the animus obsession disappears. You can say it is integrated and becomes part of the ego, because it becomes part of the personal consciousness and personal personality. At the same time, there is an archetypal part of the animus that gets its rightful place as a mediator in relation to the inner world. An archetypal part that cannot be exhausted because it belongs to the collective unconscious, but one can have maybe an inner relationship with it. Through dreams and fantasies, it can provide the consciousness with inspirations, creative impulses, and also it can provide the woman with a greater capacity to actually understand the opposite sex, men. So we leave the animals there. It's not exhausted, but go to the development of the woman. In a way, it is much easier to talk about the development of women in relation to men than it is to talk about the development of women in relation to the feminine. First, we are used to think in terms of opposites. So if you cannot agree on anything else, you can probably agree that the masculine and feminine is a pair of opposites. Secondly, the masculine is usually more visible, more well-defined than the feminine. Because we live in a male-dominated culture, the words we tend to use for the masculine are clear and more positively charged than those we tend to use for the feminine. We can also express it in another sense that the feminine as such is more unconscious. There's a paradox here. It also means that modern women, in a rejection of the old female gender roles, can easily feel compelled to turn away from the feminine in general. And then I go back to a quotation from one of the prominent women in the women's movement in the 80s, when my book was out first. Susanne Giese is her name. She says in an interview in a woman's magazine, many of us early feminists let ourselves down by putting aside our own femininity and sexuality or try to assume a stronger position both in society and in relation to men. We castrated ourselves in a way, but the result of such an attitude is that it becomes impossible to find out how to have a proper relationship with both oneself and men. I believe it is quite actual today even. And she continues, I had the backward thought in me that it was impossible to be respected on an equal footing with men if I was a sexual object. That is why I hid my femininity. I didn't believe that the two things could be reconciled. This was partly because the femininity I had come to know through my mother was useless to me. I think this writer and speaker, Susanne Giese, was expressing a generational problem. A lot of modern women have not been able to identify with the femininity they have come to know through their mothers. It seems that one of the fundamental differences between women and men is reflected in the basic relationship patterns. Girls and women aim for identification, boys and men for confrontation. Now, if the first basic psychological identification of the daughter with the mother fails, we speak usually of that's our lingo, the negative mother complex. Psychologists of all schools of thought have long attributed psychological disorders to the bad mother. And of course, there are bad mothers in the true sense, but there are many other mothers who had just been as good mothers as they were able to. When a whole generation of women complain about their bad mothers and are filled with strong negative feelings towards them, anger, disappointment, contempt, resentment, I do not think the cause is due to the individual mothers alone. Of course, it has often been said that the mother's generation have been victims of the external conditions of society that they had to accept. But I also think there is a deeper archetypal influence at work. Before, I mentioned that the first wave of women's liberation in the turn of the last century sank back into the unconscious in the 40s and 50s, when women in general try to identify again with traditional gender roles. But if we look at our culture dominated by the father archetype for many centuries, it becomes obvious that the mother archetype was pushed into the unconscious. Only very limited forms of expression of the feminine were allowed. Beautiful, the good, the pious, the pure. All other expressions were suppressed or demonized, not only by men, but also by women themselves. It is now common knowledge that if a hitherto unconscious or repressed content of the psyche is about to make its way into consciousness, its first manifestations are often chaotic and accompanied by strong and often negative emotions. What is true for the individual is also true for the culture, I think, in this context. Insofar as the mother archetype is arguably emerging in our world from centuries of repressions, maybe 1,000 years repressions, it is no wonder that the great mother is angry and bitter. By this, I mean that a good deal of modern women's anger against their mothers is in fact not only directed at them as persons, but is rooted in the archetypal background of the feminine. Anger is bottomless unless it can be brought into an archetypal context, into a common feminine pattern. When the archetypal women behind all women, through the transformation of the individual woman, achieves the more complete expression she demands, the anger is extinguished and reconciliation with the personal mother can take place, or often does. In the above, I have tried to show that the development of the woman's animus must go through an entirely personal approach to both the collective social norms on the one hand and the archetypal images on the other. In the same way, a development and differentiation of the feminine in the woman must take place. This can be at least as difficult and require great courage of spirit. No preconceived ideas about what women are and should be would help here. So we don't start with a definition of what the feminine is, which is maybe a little bit provocative. So we go to a chapter called Mothers and Daughters, or sub-chapter. Every woman is a daughter. And for every woman, the first love is directed towards the mother. How this first connection subsequently manifests itself in the woman's psyche depends, therefore, not only on the personal mother, but also which part of the feminine structural form is most prominent. Oh, I should explain, just before this, I had a review of Tony Wolf's old article of the structural forms of the feminine psyche, which he made as a kind of supplement or alternative to Jung's typology theory. But I'm not going into it; would take too long time to go into that. But what I think is all these four kinds of structures constitute an overall picture or compass of the feminine. So depending on the starting point of a woman's psychological development, that is fairly easy for one woman becomes very difficult for another. But whichever path a woman takes, it it leads to the question of the daughter's true emancipation from her mother, for only then she can gain an independent identity. In that sense, it's more easy for the boy who is different from the mother. But here we have another kind of separation, because I'm like mother. I'm a woman like mother. I'm not different in that basic sense. But unconsciously identifying with one archetype or another keeps women stuck in certain patterns, which in our culture have been patriarchal in nature. The modern woman is not content to play the role of the well-behaved daughter or the very good mother. Here, despite the pioneering work of the women's movement, we are still standing on partially virgin territory. It is not enough to do away with external forms of gender roles if they still bind us inside. You see, deep down, mother and daughter are one. They have never in our history have been really separated. Jung writes, the psyche which exists prior to consciousness, that is in a child, shares in the maternal psyche on the one hand, while on the other hand, it reaches over to the daughter psyche. We could therefore say that every mother contains her daughter within herself, and that every woman extends backward in her mother and forward into her daughter. And then my daughter was at the time 3 years old. Now she's 44, and made me a grandmother. But then she was very interested in the fact that she had been in my womb and I had been in my mother's womb. And so she spontaneously talked then about this idea. She said, when I grow up, you will be in my womb and then I'll give birth to you. So that was a very kind of, intuitive statement. She was expressing the age-old idea of cyclical return, which was dominant, for example, in the old agrarian societies. At that time, the woman's sexuality was considered sacred because it was of the same nature as the creative power of Mother Earth, and through her biological cycle, the woman formed a parallel to the great cycle of nature, the germination, growth, and death of the grain, the changing of the seasons. Sexuality was sacred because it was the expression of the fertility of all things. Where I quoted from Jung's article about the core, it's called. It is about the Demeter myth in Homer's hymns. The Demeter is the Greek mother goddess of fertility, and Core is a daughter who in the hymn was abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld. The myth is mainly concerned with Demeter's anger and attempt to reconcile her. And the daughter, Core, is completely passive and very flower-like. So Jung writes on page 219, the figure of Core which interests us here belongs, when observed in a man, to the anima type, and when observed in a woman to the superior personality type. The figure corresponding to Core in a woman is usually dual, that is, a mother and a young girl, which means that she appears sometime as one, sometime as the other. Jung recognizes that it is the same archetypal figure that is the anima in the man and the core in the woman. Furthermore, Jung states that the maiden, which appears in the case story, his case stories, differs not inconsiderable from the vaguely flower-like Cora, in that the modern figure is more sharply cut and not nearly as unconscious. He also notes that the Cora appears in women's dreams and fantasies as an unknown young girl, as a dancer, as a nymph. The girl's helplessness exposes her to all kinds of dangers, such as being eaten by reptiles or sacrificed. There may also be a descent into the realm of the dead and the search for the elusive treasure, sometimes also associated with orgiastic sexual rites or, for example, sacrifices of menstrual blood to the moon. Behind all these rites is a kind of Mother Earth figure. Jung goes on to write that these maidens are always doomed to die because their exclusive domination of the feminine psyche hinders the process of individuation, that is, the maturation of personality. The maiden, he says, corresponds to the man's anima and makes use of it to gather her natural ends, in which illusion plays the greatest role imaginable. But as long as a man is content to be femme à l'homme, she has no feminine individuality. She is empty and merely glittering, a welcome vessel for masculine projections. Woman as a personality, however, is a very different thing. Here, illusion no longer works. So when the question of personality arises, which is usually the painful fact of the second half of life, the childish form of the self disappears too. And so in a way, I was very inspired by this statement of Jung, but I also disagree with him on a certain point because I think he stops too early. The woman Jung depicts here is a man's woman, the woman who is identified with the patriarchal norms on what it means to be a woman. She's too much daughter and too little in touch with the Mother Earth part of the female psyche. My name for the core figure in a broader sense is the daughter archetype when it comes to women's psychology, but anima in the male psychology. I differentiate between the two. So the childlike, helpless form of the daughter archetype must therefore die in order for the woman to become a personality. But it can reappear in many forms. The daughter archetype does represent the transforming part of the feminine. It is the daughter that transforms, not the mother. It's always the daughter that holds the transforming aspect. I have a little quote also from Marie-Louise von Franz from her book, The Golden Ass. She comments on the Amor and Psyche fairy tale. She says that the psyche can be considered a variant of core. She says we must ask what difference is there between the mother and the daughter goddess. And in general, we can say that the daughter goddess is closer to the human than the mother goddess, just as God the Father is more remote from man than the Son Christ. The same nuance is true with regard to Cora. The girl goddess is closer to humanity, a more incarnated form of the mother goddess, and Psyche is a more humanized form of the great mother goddess. She is in a form that has all nearly reached completely human level, and only her name says that she is still a goddess. The last thing I think is, well, I think Apuleius made a literalizing, which is also known in the Renaissance, when you name your figures with gods and goddess names, and it doesn't. I don't think she's a goddess. Well, whatever. What does it mean that the mother goddess incarnates herself? We're not talking about here something theological, but about something psychological. So it is about the fact that the archetype, from being projected out in the world as a deity out there, instead is giving it humanized individual expression. The gods, so to speak, moves into the psyche. They disappear from the world. You know, Nietzsche famously declared that God was dead. For some time, our culture even believed that religion would disappear more and more and be completely replaced by a rational scientific view of life. But for a fact, we can see that this is absolutely not the case. The religious human being cannot be replaced by the technical human being. So when Jung's ideas about archetypes and the collective unconscious was declared too mystical and religious for many years, it was meant in a patronizing way at the time, but I think that today it is precisely Jung's respect for the religious and mystical side of human beings that is helping to increase interest in his work. This was in Denmark in 40 years ago, but I think it is more true today. Looking at the events of the present from the perspective of mythical events allows a different kind of interpretation of the world. It allows us to look at the psyche, so to speak, from the outside in a different and more meaningful way than which merely described human behavior in statistical terms. There are, of course, social factors that have created the opportunity for women's changing conditions in this society, in Western societies. I do not want to deny it or underestimate it, but I would argue that this is not the whole story. Behind collective social movements are collective movements in the psyche. Events happen simultaneously outside and inside. Women and men who are part of these events act, think, feel, rejoice, and suffer. There is an inner force as well as an outer one. So today, when the woman stands there as an adult, independent, responsible person and seems to have got what she asked for, she may realize that along the way, the meaning of it all was lost. She has lost the connection with her roots. She has cut the umbilical cord to the endless chain of wombs that bound her to the primordial mother from the beginning of time. And then the daughter's search for the mother begins. In the ancient myth of Demeter and Cora, it was the mother who sought for the runaway or adopted daughter. But in modern women's literature, it is the daughter who seeks the mother. Sometimes this search finds expression in the so-called women's utopias, where the mother is found in a comprehensive supra-personal version in a high-developed matriarchy. Utopian societies are created where the great mother reigns and her daughters can live. We can also observe this search back to the mother in some actual female males directions like matriarchal collective goddess movements and so on. The problems with many of these things is that they also exclude all male values. In the mother-daughter unit, there's no room for men. However, since half the world is men, to use an inverted feminist slogan, I do not believe in these strivings as a solution for the majority of women. They are in the nature of a psychological regression and escape back to the mother, back to the first stage of a woman's psychological development, the state of self-preservation, which is a term that Erik Neumann has made. It is psychologically naive to believe that the Great Mother represents all good and the Great Father all evil. The sorting between good and evil is something we do with our consciousness, with the ethics we have as individuals, or at least according to the norms of a group. The Great Mother is certainly both dark and light. She kills with one hand and gives birth and nurtures with the other. It's hard to imagine that old Mother Earth was in a moral conflict with herself when she sent floods or droughts to one people and gently rain to another. So her wrath is just as great as her love. In this part, we have a well-known parallel in most of the old gods, including the Old Testament Yahweh. Mercy and blessing alternate with punishment and rage. How much time do I have yet?
Well, we at least have until 9, even after 9. So, how much time do you need?
Oh, I can shorten it if I'm short of time because I didn't.
It would be nice to have a bit of time for conversation afterwards, but I would say 15 minutes.
15 minutes yet?
Yeah.
Okay, that will do, I'm sure.
Perfect.
Women today cannot remain standing in the outrage of oppression. With equality comes equal responsibility. However, being equal and responsible is not something that is enshrined in legal clauses. It must be experienced as a reality by the individual. Yeah, I think I'll shorten this a little bit. Yes, I will jump forward to a memory of, at the time, an elder old friend. She was a colleague and much older. She is dead now, but she told me at that time a dream that made a very deep impression of me. She had visited a Buddhist temple on a trip to Sri Lanka, and a young native man pulled her along to show her around for a tip. In the end, he insisted on showing her the statue of the future Buddha. And she was so annoyed that she spontaneously exclaimed to him, "How do you know that the future Buddha is not a woman?" He was appalled. A woman? That was unthinkable. Yeah. But shortly after, then she had a dream that she told me. She said, "I saw a very large, slightly dark-skinned, primitive woman coming towards me. In her hands, the woman carried a dark blue velvet cushion. On the cushion was a little naked girl, 1 or 2 years old. I realized that she was still too small to be away from her mother. When the big woman had come very close to me, a voice said, 'This is the future savior of the world.'" So that was a clear reaction also to her experience. It was a very luminous dream. It was hard to imagine that it was only a personal meaning. My friend felt certainly it was a kind of gift, something that did not belong to her alone. We have an image of the female self on an almost cosmic scale, and it is represented as mother and daughter. The primitive woman undoubtedly corresponds to the nature side, the Mother Earth part of the feminine. She is the mother, the great mother, who has recently given birth to a daughter. And this daughter is directly referred to as the future savior of the world. She's still too young to be away from her mother, so she cannot yet function as an independent psychic entity. To determine her nature, we are giving a single key in the dream. She's sitting on a deep blue velvet cushion. My friend said that it was the kind of thing that could be used, for instance, to carry crown regalia, something that emphasized a very valuable symbol of the central power. But it is not a king's power, it is a queen's power, since it is a girl. The blue color is usually associated with heaven and with activity of the spirit. Virgin Mary also wears a blue cloak. The little girl is therefore associated with the spiritual aspect of the feminine, with the Queen of Heaven. I think this is something very central, because modern women cannot settle for the archetypal image of the ancient mother that underpins her biological existence as a woman. She needs consciousness and she needs spirit too. The dream thus seems to point to the fact that the daughter archetype is reborn as a spiritual being, and yes, she is also shown as an ordinary girl. This means that the feminine archetypal transformative activity of the archetype also manifests itself spiritually in the psyche of the modern woman. This corresponds to experiences I have had, which I shall try to show you in the dream series, which you will not get here, but it's in the book, in the next chapter, where it is seen that the daughter archetype seems to guide the female individuation process. The daughter archetype shares in the great mother and the female self on the one hand, and the female ego on the other. This gives her a kind of shadowy character for the ego, but she's more comprehensive or enigmatic than ordinary shadow figures are. The daughter archetype can be activated in this way in women who consciously do not identify with the daughter role, which is different, but have distanced themselves from it. This can happen in the first half of life as well as in the second. Yeah. I have a long discussion of Jung's discussion in his book Answers to Job's question about the dogma of Mary's conception in an uplifting in heaven, which he was very interested in. It was in 48 or something, 1948 or something, and especially that she had been admitted with her body into the heaven and had entered the heavenly bridal chamber where she was united with the bridegroom Christ. So it may sound strange that Jung took these things so seriously. He was not a Catholic, but he saw them psychologically. He believed that the development of this dogma gave expression to an eternal archetypal event, which has always been there in the heavens, but only became realized on earth when they find their expression in time and space as actual historical events. So he thought that a divine child was now being conceived. It has a little parallel to the dream I was referring to. He also thought that he was almost possessed by his quaternity. So he thought that the male threeness had now been completed into a fourness. That was the image of wholeness. But we could go a step further and dare to think that the natural fourness consists of father, son, mother, and daughter. And it doesn't in Jung. There was something I only realized after this book, that actually there was no room for the daughter in the same way that there were room for the other three kind of figures. So about the spiritual, we are accustomed really from classic literature to considering animus alone as an expression of the spiritual in women. But earlier I mentioned that I do not believe that the spiritual side of the animus can be integrated if there's no corresponding development of the feminine in the woman. Then the spiritual animus has the effect which Jung also mentioned, that the feminine expression becomes perfectionistic and striving for purity, and so places itself a little below the masculine spiritual ideal. Now I believe that in this constrained situation of the feminine, both in women and men, the daughter archetype emerges in the psyche as the expression of a feminine spiritual activity which is not, however, separated from its instinctive foundation. So in the process of individuation, then we must set an optimal goal that the woman, on the one hand, is brought in contact with the great mother and the instinctive part of her own psyche, and thus can free herself from her personal mother, but also that, on the other hand, through the activity of the daughter archetype, she's connected with the transforming aspect of the feminine. This is a future-oriented activity, the Puella eternity archetype, not as the eternal daughter in the relation to the spiritual values of the fathers, but in the archetypal activity as the beginning of the new. Through the transforming activity of the daughter archetype, women can enter as equal partner in the renewal of the cultural and spiritual values that are so urgently needed. It is this very need that has called her forth from the psyches of women and men. I'm at the last section now. Is that okay? About female individuation. Of course, individuation is something individual. The female soul journey, its death and rebirth, and its encounter with the self is something that the individual woman must experience in order to come to a realization of her uniqueness as a woman. Male individuation, after all, has some fairly well-described phases. The hero's separation from the world, the integration of the shadow, his search for the elusive treasure, the night journey through the unconscious, the defeat of the dragon, and the conquest of the anima, and finally realization of the self or rebirth. Death and rebirth plays a huge role mythologically and psychologically, with rebirth corresponding to the synthesis of the conscious of the unconscious. It involves an attitude that can best be adopted by one who knows from personal experience to what degree the part always obliged to the whole, that is the society of the collective, and yet remains a whole in itself. The big problem when you look at most of the materials, the mythology, the alchemical stories, or quotation, the phases, it is that it is almost always seen from the point of view of male psychology. And we cannot simply assume that the female individuation pattern is identical with the male. Since consciousness in our long culture has been male-dominated, the known myths, etc., will to a large extent compensate for and expand male consciousness. In this sense, the land of the unconscious is more clearly mapped out for the male psyche. But the woman has historically held the place of the unconscious. Myths that refer to the female unconscious, the matriarchal psyche, are very old, archaic, and alien, may show patterns that seem strange or even repulsive to many a modern female consciousness. However, this distance in time is compensated for by the fact that the woman's ego is often less rigidly rational than the male ego, and she nevertheless gives herself up more easily in the process. But could we find some phases of female individuation? I asked myself at the time, and I found a writer, Annie Pratt, who had been studying a large number of British and American women's books of the type that in a more or less symbolic way sends a heroine on a search for her own identity. That would be a kind of individuation stories. She's not talking that way because she's not a Jungian. But she says that the heroine's soul journey seems to be somewhat different from the hero. What is interesting to me is that her findings also covered the spontaneous material produced through dreams. So I actually used in the dream series of the female individuation, I use her phases as headings for this dream series, which you will not have, but you will have now the phases. Anish Pratt writes that you understand the female ego or persona as that which lives in an everyday world of cultural experience, which is by definition a world of family and social norms. And from that, she sets out a scheme of 7 phases with the reasonable reservation that not all phases are, of course, represented in all her novels, the novels she studied. I will largely omit her references to women's lead fiction, since in this context it is the actual phases of individuation that interest me. The phase 1 she calls the separation from the ego world. The first phase starts with the sudden realization of dissatisfaction with the typical roles and norms in which the heroine is trapped. This realization leads her to take the leap into the unknown, so to speak. She starts her inner journey into the matriarchal psyche. And that is a position which is well known to any therapist. Starts with dissatisfaction. So her phase 2, she calls the Green World's Guide. The Green World's Guide or sign helps the heroine across the threshold. Here the heroine is helped across the threshold of the unconscious by an apparently ordinary phenomenon which assumes an extraordinary significance. This phenomenon belongs to the natural world and may come from an animal or from a natural phenomenon. It can be many things. And then the third phase, she calls the confrontation with the parental figures. This is not a confrontation with the parents on the level of reality. In the novels, for instance, this may be made clear by the fact that the parent is dead in the novels. It's about an inner encounter with the parents that reaches down to the parental archetypes deep in the unconscious. This encounter is the key to the journal ahead. The parental images must be transformed in order for them to function as archetypal guides. And then she has phase 4, which she called the lover in the green world. Very nice phrase. The animus figure is distinctly non-patriarchal. The encounter with it is primarily concerned with the heroine's initiation and the integration of her sexual and natural energies, the inner Pan, an ancient nature deity. It may be an ideal superpersonal figure, a deity representing fertility and death and rebirth. It may be an animal, for instance, a buffalo or a unicorn, or it may be that a human lover in this phase takes on superhuman dimensions on a fantasy level. So the phase 5, not at all well, because now comes the difficulties. She calls it the shadow, but she says this phase involves a struggle with an acceptance of one's worst sides, one's anti-ego. So, but she calls it the shadow, but in Jung's psychology, we always, refers to the shadow as a figure of the same sex as oneself. So Pratt's shadow is male, even if the figure is a heroine. So I would call it an animus figure, just to have the terminology straight. But in any case, it is very negative, can be symbolized by a devil or by demonic, life-denying and self-hating characteristics. Interestingly, Pratt says that this shadow stands for power and death in the matriarchal world. This is consistent with my experience that the shadow in the Jungian sense does not play, in the Jungian sense, does not play nearly a big as role for women as it does for men. But it is the case with this kind of demonic animus, which we usually struggle a lot with as women. Then you have phase 6, the final descent to the nadir. In this phase, the heroine is taken to the deepest places. It's a dangerous phase, which in the fiction can lead to madness as well as to transformation. A chaos of surreal images and symbols appear. They represent the actual experience of death, where the heroine either disintegrates or experiences the point of transformation in her quest. But even if the heroine is able to make the leap through this layer of being, she will have problems with the ascension phase and her return to the normal society, which is phase 7, which is ascension and return to the known world. For the fully transformed woman, her return to society is more difficult than for the male hero, because, as Pratt says, her one elixir of life is not only developed by society, but is a threat to it. This is why she believes so many of these types of novels end inconclusively. Sometimes, however, the heroine is provided with a new space, and although the heroine is unable to influence the wider world, she is often described as passing on her elixir to a younger woman or initiating herself as a daughter in relation to an idealized mother figure. And finally, Pratt says the transformed heroine seems to pass on her elixir not to anyone within the text, but to the female reader. So all of this, you would, in the hero's quest, he comes back as a victor. But here it seems that the solutions also often are unsatisfactory in the traditional sense. But in my opinion, this points to several things. First, the big question mark: what happens really when women start to become themselves? It is something new that women are struggling towards such a consciousness. Secondly, many of these protagonists are driven by their own contemporary neurosis, and the self-transformation is primarily a healing process if successful. But it is psychologically very realistic that an influence on the surrounding society does not automatically result from the transformation. This possibility, I think, is left for the future, for the younger woman, to the reader, to an utopian matriarchal society. But, and this is even more important, such a transformation is a necessary precondition for an influence to gradually take place. Those who go first always have the fate of not reaping the fruits of what they sow. So that was how I end here.
That was, most of all, fantastic. Thank you very much, Pia, for this inspiring and thought-provoking presentation, especially considering you wrote it 40 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with most of it. But, I was happy to see still.
Nothing has changed. Okay.
Oh, not much.
So, not much. Now we come to the interactive part. That means
Yes.
the audience, you, if you have questions, if you have comments, raise your digital hand or write something in the chat. I can imagine there might be some questions. I hope there are some questions. A bit of shyness right now, but maybe da. Anne de Blauwe, you have to unmute yourself.
Hello. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I was just wondering, can you elaborate a little bit more on the topic of the utopian matriarchy, please?
It exists mostly in the literature, I think,
Yes.
and not in the real world.
No. Okay. Is it like a sisterhood of moon shamanistic? How do I have to see?
Yeah,
What can I imagine with that?
that is not a real thing, I think. I know there are movements in that direction. You can see it on the internet, for instance. You can really, but it's not what I'm thinking. I'm not thinking in that direction because I don't believe in utopias. They have never proven real ever. So we are humans. We are all humans. But the fantasy about it, I'm talking about the fantasy about it.
Yes, I know, but I was just thinking, what would they use in the fiction literature? Do you have an example?
Yeah. What? Oh, I forgot the author's name. I'm getting old. I'm sorry, but the author from South Africa who wrote marriages between the different zones. Different zones. Remember that book? There was a series of book, and in one of the book we begin in a very sophisticated matriarchal utopian society. But one of the main persons is forced to marry a man from a lower society and kind of make him more conscious. And then in the end, on his part, he is marrying a woman from an even lower, wilder, Amazon-like society.
Yes, I was there.
Yeah.
The
You remember
Amazon.
that?
Yeah.
That's one of the better ones, I think. Very interesting ones. What is the name of the author? You
I
remember?
can't remember. No, I don't know the name, but I know what you mean. I see it in here in my head. Thank you. Mute. Yes.
Thank you for the question. Anybody else? Maybe you just said you agree with what you wrote, but maybe considering the time span and considering discussions around gender identity and individuation, what, if you could, would you like to expand upon today if you had the chance to write an annex or
What I have been expanded on in during the years, I have been expanding on clarifying the idea of the daughter archetype because it is not so very clear. So I've been studying that. I've also written a book of Inanna, the great Sumerian goddess, which is a daughter archetype goddess, and which was so fascinating studying the hymns and mythology about her, and especially because one of the poems to her from 2,000 years before Christ was actually written by a woman who was worshipping Inanna and was a priest, had a high priest seat. And it is the oldest personal poet we know, poetress we know about. So it is a woman, not a man. So it's because we have a section where she describes her own problems and how she was overcome by a man, terrible man, who threw her away from her office, and how she tried to awaken the goddess Inanna to help her to get a revenge, come back. So that is very, very interesting. So that I worked on, and then also I worked on finding in fairy tales, because what was it about the female protagonists in fairy tales at that time? They were dismissed by feminists because, well, it's only about girls who sits and waits for the prince. So, and it is mostly in Grimm's collection. So I went on to work with to find realize a structure. I went on to find, fairy tales with active heroines. What would they do? And there's a lot of them if you start to look for them. So that was something I worked on.
Thank you. Claudette.
Yes, thank you very much. I certainly would have appreciated your book back in the 80s. I wish I'd had it. There were a lot of things that you talked about that I could relate to, but I want to just pick on one thing that I had problems with, in a sense. When you were talking about, I mean, a lot of what you said about masculine and feminine, I have difficulty with because I don't believe in those concepts. But so when you talked about women and the animus, it seemed very heterosexual. And I just wonder how you would think about it for people who are not heterosexual. Like how you...
Yeah. When the book here was going out into English, my daughter, who's now 44, read it, and she said, well, you are going to be cancelled because you're only talking about two sexes. And it's true, you were not talking about these things 40 years ago.
No,
but what I am talking about is fluid gender, not fluid sex, but fluid gender. I'm talking about many ways to be a woman. That was what I was occupied by, and the same for men, if you would transfer it. So you could have many ways to express yourself being a woman.
no, I agree with that. But if you're talking about something called the animus, you're talking about it being projected onto men, how would a lesbian, for example, or a non-binary person make sense out of that?
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I thought about it, but that's how it was. I don't.
No, I understand, but like maybe now, then, would you think about it differently now?
I would address it now. I think if I had, tried to read it, I would address it.
Mm-hmm.
But also lesbian woman has relationship with men and the masculine.
Yeah, well, with men.
Not as love partners, but in many ways. And also non-binary people have relationship with both, because our dreams cannot personify persons.
No, I agree with
attributes. Yeah.
Well, I can agree with that, but as soon as you start using words like masculine and feminine, to me, that's patriarchal. I mean, I appreciated your criticism of the patriarchal structure we're sort of stuck in still. And it seems to me when we use those terms, we're stuck in the patriarchy again. We're using patriarchal terms to try to understand human beings instead of using some other kind of terms.
Yeah. what I did initiate here, but didn't complete, was a redefinition also, and because in the classical Jungian theory, animus and anima are defined by properties. Animus are the word, the meaning, the intellect, and so on, and anima are the life and the emotion and so on. And I think it is wrong to define these figures by properties. You don't have to, you can keep the concepts and just, discuss them when you have a patient and a dream in the context of what do they mean. Because for instance, with a thinking type woman, she would often have, a feeling animus, not a thinking animus, because she thinks well to herself. Do you get my point? Yeah, or is it still,
I still have a problem with the language because I don't think you can use words like masculine or animus without everybody thinking man. That's just, we have that built into our language structure. So unless we find different ways of talking about it, I don't see how we ever get out of the patriarchal binary stuff.
Okay.
But I appreciate what you said, and I appreciate your thinking about it. And I realized you couldn't have done this in the 80s. You're right. It was hardly ever talked about by Jungians, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your comment.
Thanks for that. One question from the chat, and then we have also Dennis Merritt. Tara Zangi is asking a couple of examples of active heroine fairy tales. Do you have some?
Oh, yes, I have many, actually. I mentioned one, I was in the spotlight recently. They have concentrated on fairy tales, and there I had mentioned one of my favorites is King Lindworm. It is Norwegian fairy tales. It starts with the princess who has a dream. She dreams of a golden wreath, and she thinks she can't live without it. And then she meets an ice bear who has such a thing in his lap, and won't sell it, but only if she wants to go with him. And she's saying, yeah, I'm going with you. It is different because in many of these Beauty and Beast versions, the girl would sacrifice herself for the family or for money or something. She wouldn't go willingly, but this one goes willingly with the ice bear and lives with him in the palace and sees him, only in night, and gives birth to 3 daughters and so on. And then she throws light of him and he flies away. But then the whole story is about her following him and how she struggles to win him back and overcome the witch who has bewitched him. Now he has to marry this witch. Yeah.
Thank you. Dennis has a question.
Yes, I had trouble figuring out how to raise my hand. That's why I literally did it. Just one comment. I've done a lot of work with Jung, and I just find the yin yang and yin and yang energy. You can see how yin or yang would be rather naturally associated with the masculine, but with regard to what the previous person was saying, that we can disconnect it from it, but see that whether it would be some natural tendency to see it that way, but that's not what the pure form is. But I was, I really was taken by your going back to Jung's fascination by the assumption of the Virgin Mary or the Mary by bodily assumption by the Catholics, because Jung saw that occurring in Protestant women. That's why he thought the archetype was so important. And my thought was that you had the bodily ascension of Jesus. So here you have the male archetypal energy, if you will, the phallic and the testosterone and so on. And then what does it mean then for the feminine if you would associate it more with the body and the earth and so on being assumpted? And I've been very interested in eco-psychology and nature. And I think of Teilhard de Chardin's, the way he talked about the spirit in matter, and that would be much more along the lines of the way indigenous cultures see nature, that there's a spirit in the soil and in the atoms and everything.
Yes.
So I was putting it together, and Jung said one of the qualities of the New Age would be kind of a resurgence or coming of the archetypal feminine energy. So if we put that in the broadest sense, we have to have a sense of the sacred about nature if there's any chance that we're going to save our planet. So those were some of the thoughts that came there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the old alchemists thought that there was spirit in the matter. So that was their...
Exactly. They were trying to re-sanctify nature.
Yes.
The alchemist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful piece. I think I'm going to have to buy your book.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Does anyone else have a comment and wants to share why he's going to or she's going to buy the book after this presentation, or any other questions left? If not, again, thank you, Pia.
Thank you
for being with us tonight, for giving this fantastic presentation, for writing this like 40 years ago, which is still contemporary. And yeah, everyone, thank you for taking part tonight or today. The link to the book to Amazon is in the chat. And maybe another thing, if you think, oh, I am writing something, I have a script, I'm thinking about publishing it, let us know. We'll be happy to have a look at it. And as we wrap up, I want to give you a little hint. If you want, we can meet again in 2 weeks. On the 29th of January, we will be hosting Jungian analyst Barbara Holyfield, who will present her book, Being with the Body in Depth Psychology. This work explores how the subjectively experienced body integrates into depth psychology practice. If you're interested in that, we're happy if you join us. We will inform you through our channels, Instagram, Facebook, and so on. And yeah, thank you, Pia. Thank you, everyone else. And we look forward to seeing you. Night.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.